Then if you press the blue button, you'll be allowed to continue in the session.
Right.
Welcome, everybody. My name is Loretta Garcia. I'm the co-chair of the Contemporary Issues Forum this year, along with Dale Miller-Hill. We ask all participants to keep your microphone muted during the session so as not to interrupt the speaker. We will allow a question and answer period afterwards. But if you want to post your questions in the chat, I'll be checking those periodically and consolidating any similar ones. And then we can ask those after the presentation is completed. I just want to mention that on March 16th, our speaker will be Elizabeth Bowie. Some of you may know her as a previous member of River Road. She now lives in England, and she got a PhD and works in user-friendly online solutions. So she will be speaking to us about that. And then today's speaker is Peter Wilson. Some of you may know him as a longtime member of River Road. He is a security consultant for the RAND Corporation, and he's an adjunct professor at American University's Osher Lifelong Learning Institute. And so today he's going to be speaking with us about security challenges for the Biden administration. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Peter, and go ahead, take it away, Peter.
Okay, thank you, Loretta. Today we're going to talk about now it's in its first anniversary, the first great European war in the 21st century, which is the war of aggression by Russia against Ukraine. And I'm going to give you an appreciation about where I think the war is, where it might go in the near future, and some of the broader implications. In the Q&A, because of the reality of time, there are a lot of issues about the impact that this war is having on the global energy supply demand system, which are very dramatic, almost as dramatic as the war itself, that we can talk about, and other issues. Obviously, it's not just about Russia, Ukraine. The Biden administration has, as they say, had to clearly learn how to walk and chew gum at the same time. It's had to deal with a whole host of other issues, not only the foreign affairs issues, such as dealing with China, etc., but also, obviously, during certainly last year, the execution, the successful passage of a rather, if not dramatically ambitious domestic agenda under, as they say, challenging domestic circumstances. This is somehow, I don't know if I can get rid of this. That's for Loretta. Loretta, if you can somehow enable this, the info to disappear off of the screen, I appreciate it.
Oh, are you seeing the participants?
Yeah, no, I've dropped the participants. It's the
sidebar,
closed captioning, who can see transcripts.
Okay.
No,
well, I can't disable that, but if you
click on the X's of the button. Okay.
So they will pop up.
Maybe they'll all go away.
Okay, so maybe I'll ask people.
I got it.
Okay, so if people can limit your posting in the chats until after the session, that will be better. It won't have the pop-ups.
Anyway, to back up, this is what is known as a gray swan scenario that is forecastable. It was uncertain probability and of great consequence. Let's face it, this decision by this one man, Vladimir Putin, next to him, by the way, to his left is Valery Gerasimov, who is the chief of staff and chief architect of this war, and currently has been finally, after almost 8 months of the war, been appointed as the Supremo Commander to try to execute what they thought was going to be a brilliant, quick victory, which has now turned into a staggeringly disastrous war of attrition with a state that Vladimir Putin himself denies its right to exist. The other gentleman to his right is Shoigu, the Minister of Defense. This group cadre has been here, and it's noteworthy that Putin has not fired either one of them. If anything, he's given them more power. So there was an intense negotiation that went on behind the scenes between the Biden administration and the Kremlin to try to turn this war off. The Biden administration became convinced by the fall of 2021 that the Russians actually were going to invade. Most everybody is very skeptical, above all, the Ukrainians themselves, who know a great deal about the Russian military, and frankly didn't really believe that they were ready for war. And they also, their attitude by many of them was, Putin's too smart to roll the dice, but he did. Here we are, 11 now, 12 months on, and this is the situation after a long, bitter fight, which led to basically the evisceration of the Russian military. They've taken enormous personnel and material losses at the hands of the Ukrainians, who have increasingly been heavily armed by NATO and the United States in particular. The air campaign that began was a failure. They were forced to drop their attempts to seize Kyiv and Kharkiv, the second largest city in Ukraine, in an overnight, if you will, blitzkrieg. Again, material loss is, this chart is probably out of date. They probably have lost maybe up to 70,000 killed, and therefore probably another 150,000 seriously wounded. Keep in mind, this is the casualty rate that we suffered in Vietnam over the course of 10 years. This is in the course of months. This is also a sign of the nature of this war. This is a two-sided war with both sides equipped with modern, advanced long-range strike weapons and other precision-guided munitions, which I'll talk about. Again, there's been enormous attrition. Also, the Ukrainians have suffered very heavy losses, both civilian killed due to the various robotic bombardment campaigns. The Russians right now are resorting to really the tactics of World War I, where they're using the mass use of infantry and artillery. I must say that if you want to get a sense of what this fighting is like, just go see the movie All Quiet on the Western Front. If you want to get a sense of the character of the fighting that's going on in the Donbass, around a number of these areas where, again, the Russians are attempting to use mass in a form that we haven't seen since we were fighting the Red Chinese in Korea during 1950, 51, 52. This is a very important part of the weapons technology that we gave initially to the Ukrainians. They were vital. They were both guided munitions that were both anti-tank, like the weapon on the set was a picture of the Javelin missile being launched in a test operation. Also a wide range of portable anti-aircraft weapons, like the weapon below, the three-tube British-designed Starstreak, which is a laser-guided weapon. These weapons have turned out to be extremely effective. The failure of the quick strike to decapitate the regime failed. What happened here, Zelensky became Churchill of Ukraine. I remember vividly having a conversation with a group of senior Ukrainians before the war, and I asked them, will he invade? And the reaction was, no, Vladimir is too smart to do that. And also they said, the Russian army really isn't ready. And then I said, well, what if they do invade? What will this guy Zelensky do? And they basically said, he'll either run away as a frightened child or he'll be Churchill. He's turned out to be Churchill, or the equivalent, in my opinion. a remarkable leader. Again, it's interesting to reflect on this from our perspective, not to overdo the analogy, but he does have, as I say, this command of the media in the same way that Ronald Reagan did, also being an actor, a very powerful element of being a leader in the 21st century, a talent that you really need to have. Again, the Russians made a series of tactical operational mistakes. Also, they started the war late. Originally, a suggestion that they wanted to launch the invasion in January when the ground was frozen in Ukraine, like here, like around the rest of the world, Northern Hemisphere, courtesy of climate change. The weather was much warmer. And so by late February, the ground, especially northern part of Kyiv, had turned once again into a bog. And so this is one of the things that helped the Ukrainians in their desperate early hours to successfully blunt the assault on Kyiv and also in Kharkiv. And then further south, though, in the Donbass region around the Azov and Black Sea, the Blitzkrieg was more successful, and they made further progress. The other aspect about this is a military technical issue, which I will not dwell on too long, but the reality, as you can see in the silhouette, the main battle tank that is in use by the Russians, and there are variations of this vehicle, the T-72, this was a vehicle optimized for offensive operations to be very lightweight, weighing roughly 40 metric tons, compared to, as you can see in the silhouette of an M1 battle tank, which is truly a land dreadnought battleship, weighing 75 tons. They also decided to make it much smaller, so they focused on mobility and firepower, went to a three-man crew, and created a very elegant automatic loader design, which allowed them to get rid of the fourth person, which is the loader, the person who lifts up the shell and rams it into the artillery piece of the tank. The trouble with that concept, all of the ammunition was inside what is called the fighting compartment. And so if you had a projectile or a jet of burning metal associated with an anti-tank weapon penetrate the combat compartment, the tank became an instantaneous crematoria. And that's why you see pictures of the turrets that have been blown off the tank, is because in essence, you've had an internal extraordinary high heat explosion, which naturally, sometimes the crew can bail out in time, but more often than not are basically incinerated. And most of these fighting vehicles, by the way, that the Russians have deployed in this regard have been destroyed or captured. And so therefore, interestingly enough, the Russians, as we speak, are resorting to refurbishing tanks that have been in storage for more than 30 years to supply to their troops in the field today. Again, the dominance of precision-guided weapons in the early phases of the war. A picture above is an interception of a Russian attack helicopter. The weapon that you see being held by the Ukrainian is again one of these short-range anti-tank weapons, which are extremely lethal. And fighting up north of Kyiv was, by the way, very similar to the fighting between the Finns and the Russians during the Winter War of 1939-1940, and had some of the same features and outcome for the Russian army. Russians got frustrated that their campaign had failed. They basically pulled back in their military operations up in the north into much of the east. So basically, Kyiv and Kharkiv were not menaced anymore by ground forces. They continually being subject to bombardment. But one thing is that the Ukrainian air defenses were good enough so that the Russian manned air force, so fighter bombers and medium bombers, could not be used to attack targets outside of, if you will, the occupation zone of the Russian army, and therefore significantly reduced the effectiveness of the Russian Air Force. Although we've seen a campaign that reminds one of the Nazi bombardment campaign of London during 1944 using V1s and V2s, that is, cruise missiles and ballistic missiles. Fortunately for the Ukrainians, the Russians seem to have a lack of capacity, industrial capacity, to rapidly replace these munitions that largely have been aimed at civilian targets, and only in the last few months has been much more effectively aimed at the electric power grid. Again, the Russian Navy has basically been knocked out of the war. It still launches intermittently long-range cruise missiles from some of its corvettes, but basically the Black Sea Fleet, which was highly touted, and one of the most important aspects of Ukrainian success, especially the sinking of Moskva, with actually Ukrainian-designed cruise missiles, anti-ship missiles, called the Neptune. The Russians attempt or plans to carry out a series of amphibious assaults as part of their plan to quickly seize the key port facility of Odessa, port town, if you will. It's analogous to, I guess, Baltimore, failed early in the war. And now the Ukrainians are increasingly using unmanned, if you will, suicide boats to attack what's left of the Russian fleet. Again, this war is increasingly dominated by firepower, long-range strike weapons. And again, fighting that's gone on in the Donbass area really has the features of a 1916 Verdun-style battle dominated by artillery and other indirect fire means. Again, the Russians have shown a measure of competence from time to time using their electronic warfare systems to jam Ukrainian drones. But again, there have been countermeasures on the part of the Ukrainians. And so this aspect of the war is now a new feature, and that is the widespread use of these unmanned aerial vehicles for reconnaissance and also for direct attack against facilities or personnel or equipment. And so again, what's happening here, the question mark is, when will the Ukrainians be prepared to launch a major offensive? It looks like now, I thought it might occur as early as this January when the ground was frozen, but they had another warm winter. And so therefore, the ground in much of Ukraine remained, as they say, a bog. It's that black earth. I'm sure people from Iowa appreciate this phenomenon that is in the fall and the summer rains, that it's very hard even for all so-called all-terrain vehicles that cross the countryside like tractors. So the reality is that we now await a Russian attempt to try to continue an offensive that looks very much like World War I at vast cost to the Russian army to break through in certain areas of Donbass, while the Ukrainians accumulate more advanced weapons from NATO to get ready for a counteroffensive, which now I suspect does not start until the ground gets dried out, which is sometime in May. Again, these are the long-range strike weapons that we have deployed with the Ukrainians. The one in the middle is called ATACMS. It's basically a short-range ballistic missile that has a range of roughly 300 miles. We have been reluctant to provide that particular piece of ammunition, fearful the Ukrainians would retaliate against Russia proper. In the end, I suspect the weapon will be deployed with a promise that only what is defined as Ukraine, which includes the Crimean Peninsula, as legitimate areas of target. With these weapons, though, the Ukrainians have actually been able to have great success, especially in their counteroffensives during this fall when they retook the large city called Kherson in the south, near the Black Sea, a port facility, as well as some real success in liberating areas around Kharkiv further to the east. Right now, we have roughly a 600-mile-long, relatively static front. And then the question is, who is going to strike most effectively to change this static situation? I recommend, by the way, that you all read this morning's Sunday Washington Post. It's got some very good maps of this whole conflict. And again, the question is, will the Russian army break? For me personally, as a professional, as a historian of dealing with war, I have expected this Russian army was going to break much earlier. So far, it hasn't. But there are many features about this conflict which suggest that this war may make a very rapid turn in favor of the Ukrainians if the Ukrainians are able to organize a serious counteroffensive in one or more of the regions of the current combat zone. And again, as we've had Ukrainians signal that they were going to attack initially in the south. They attacked up in the east with great success, and then finally again drive the Russians on the, if you will, the left side of the Dnieper River. But again, this war is far from over. Putin is up the ante. One of the aspects about this war is that you can be sent to prison for 15 years if you're a Russian and describe this as a war. I'm kidding, it's now in the legislation. This is called a special military operation. A euphemism, I mean, again, this is very much news speak. This is again, Putin, in my opinion, and I would say the analogy here is why did Lyndon Johnson not mobilize the National Guard during the Vietnam War? It's because what it meant is that you had a lot of voters, especially out of the Midwest, et cetera, being compelled to fight this war. Also older men who were better educated and even more likely to be less manageable. And so Putin, in essence, tried the same thing here and has attempted to try to shield the populations of the major cities, more specifically St. Petersburg and Moscow, from the burdens of this war. Most of the people who have fought and died are either out of the Russian prisons, most of them being fed to a special, technically illegal private military corporation. This is Putin's chefs, Prigozhin's Wagner Group, which have been vital in trying to seize territory from Ukraine in these brutal World War-style battles. And the other is they've been basically, it's imagining if we had carried out a recruitment process where we only recruited from states that voted for Donald Trump, that is the rural states. And that's in essence what Putin has tried to do to minimize the domestic. Now he's being driven to possibly recruit college students, et cetera, because of the desperate need to get reasonably capable forces to fight a Ukrainian army, which is learning how to fight in an ever more modern way. And so all the signs suggest he is going to double down and is quite happy, or not happy, but is prepared to sacrifice another 50, 70, 100,000 or more Russians to effectively wear out the Ukrainians. And he's still expecting to wear out us for giving political, economic, and military support. Also, from time to time, another aspect about him, and this is one of the ominous features of this conflict, is the shadow or the presence of nuclear weapons. And let's face it, grimly, he has set an example to all of us that is nuclear weapons are actually very useful, not in their use, but their presence. Because what he has done, and my analogy here is the US dollar as a reserve currency. The presence of nuclear weapons provides in wartime somewhat of a unique, inordinate privilege, in the sense that Russia has been able to carry out months-long bombing campaign of Ukrainian civilian targets, and Ukraine's supporters, e.g. the United States and others, have been very cautious in trying to compel Ukraine not to retaliate because of the fear that Russia might use nuclear weapons, either against Ukraine or against NATO, and that would be the beginning of what I would describe as World War IV, not World War III. We've already fought that. That was our Cold War with the Soviet Empire. No, that's feature, and the Russians understand this. On the other hand, I think because the war has gone on so long, these kinds of threats, vague or not so vague, have had less and less effect. Down the road, one of the big question marks here, what if the Russian army starts to collapse? And then the Ukrainians have an opportunity in that disarray to retake Crimea. That might be a point when the war gets extremely dangerous. Again, the mobilization process was a mess. And roughly, best estimate is somewhere between 500,000 and 1 million young Russians, the best and the brightest, have all left. There's been an evisceration of the Russian economy long term. Many of the Ukrainians, roughly 8 million Ukrainian civilians, mainly elderly women and children, it's on the lifeboat first, took the trains into Europe. We have absorbed right now, as we speak, well over 100,000 Ukrainians, without a peep from anybody. But the point being is that the whole process, again, one of the aspects of this conflict, as a participant in this business for a long time, who has done a great deal of work studying the Russian army, its military industrial sector, is we knew there was corruption, serious corruption. We never knew the degree of the rottenness and incompetence at all levels. And that's one of the things the mobilization process revealed, is how terribly unprepared they were for a long war. It goes back to, and I will use the comparison. This was the same mindset of our members of our community, the neocons, who thought the war in Iraq was going to be a short 90-day wonder, and it would be all over. And that set of assumptions profoundly affected the way they thought we would have to fight. And they were then surprised in a much more profound scale. That's the exact miscalculation that Vladimir Putin thought, that this war was going to be short. Again, will the Ukrainians get enough American equipment? One of their big success stories, they carried out a successful commando operation. It appears to be a truck bomb that blew up the twin bridges that connect the Kerch bridge system, which connects Crimea across the Kerch Strait to Russia proper. That rail and road bridge were very badly damaged by a brilliant act of sabotage, and has made it much more difficult for the Russians to sustain their army, because one of the interesting features of the Russian army is it has lots of tanks, lots of artillery, but no trucks. Interestingly enough, it's highly reliant on its rail system to provide military logistics. So if it is operating far from a railhead, this is sort of reminds you of the way we fought the Civil War. That is, we could move lots of men and material by rail, but once you tried to get to the battlefield, you had to walk or had to rely on horse-drawn wagons or whatever. There's this analogous situation here with the Russian army. It's extremely railroad bound to a degree which is surprising. Instead of spending a lot of money on some of the very spiffy, fancy weapons, they might well have spent a lot more time and energy on building truck brigades. But again, they were assuming that the war was going to be over, so these matters weren't going to become important. Russia, again, has continued to retaliate in a systematic way, far more effectively, I might add, than the first opening campaign. Part of the reason why the power grid was not attacked in the opening phase of the war is the Russians again expected to control all of that. So they didn't want to destroy assets they were going to seize. Later on, you know, we have with this war of attrition and revenge on the part of the Kremlin is to say, if we can't keep Ukraine, we're going to do our best to destroy it. And again, they have large capacity to strike, but this ammunition, interestingly enough, long-range cruise missiles, even ballistic missiles and other advanced weapons are very reliant on the importation of microprocessors from the United States, Asia, and Europe. It's one of the interesting aspects that's been fully revealed is how globalized the Russian economy had become. And that's not surprising because, after all, Russia is like Saudi Arabia, except it has nuclear weapons. It's a petropower, And it was more convenient for them to buy material like microprocessors from abroad, as opposed to have their own internal capacity to produce them. Now, in real time, this is a major deficiency, and one of the reasons why the Russians are having difficulty replicating or building more long-range precision-guided munitions to fire at the Ukrainians, much less menace anybody else. And again, there's this potential threat against Europe and the United States, but that's at this moment has disappeared into the bombardment campaign of Ukraine. Interestingly enough, and this is another feature of this war, is the alliance, probably of convenience, but a very serious one that's emerging between Russia and Iran. The Islamic Republic of Iran, and that is Iran, out of necessity, has invested heavily in these robotic weapons because it can't acquire modern aircraft because of the sanctions, or can't afford it for that matter. And so the Iranians have turned out to be big innovators in this, and in fact revealed their capacity to innovate with their ability to attack Saudi oil production facilities with these types of weapons, arm the Houthi to attack Saudi Arabia, and also even bombard us with precision-guided weapons. So interestingly enough, now Russia is starting a major transfer program relationship with Iran out of necessity to acquire literally ammunition, guided munitions. In turn, Russia is going to provide advanced military technology like advanced fighter bombers. Here we are. And the most worrisome weapon here is whether the Iranians will give them the weapon shown in the middle here, which is called the Fatah 101. There's different variants of this missile. What's notable about this missile, it's a precision-guided short-range ballistic missile. And that kind of weapon, like the V2 of 1944, is very difficult to shoot down. You have to have very advanced weapons. They're now starting to provide limited numbers of what are called Patriot, who have the capacity to shoot down this missile. But the numbers of defense weapons means that we can only defend relatively small areas of Ukraine against this kind of threat. The big question mark here, will Iran be so provocative as to provide this class of weapon? They are clearly providing attack drones in very large numbers. We're now providing an increasingly sophisticated air defense system with the most advanced, actually, air defense systems we have. In fact, in many ways, we're denuding the NATO defense forces to basically fight the Russians in Ukraine. That's in essence what's going on here. This is that we are consciously, this is, whether we formally declare it, it is in essence a proxy war. But I'll remind you, we've been on the wrong side of these proxy wars before. May I recall for you Vietnam. We are now playing the same role the Chinese and the Russians played in supporting Vietnam in a protracted war to, in essence, frustrate the imperial designs of a great power, United States. Flip this around, that's where we are from a historical perspective. Again, there's big debate. The guy in the blue suit there is Olaf Scholz, the Chancellor of Germany, standing in front of what is called a Leopard 2. This is the German version of the Abrams M1. It's slightly lighter weight, but still extraordinarily well armored and equipped. We and the Germans are now supplying also what are called infantry fighting vehicles. Above is what is called the Marder. Down below is our Bradley, which we've used extensively in our wars in the Middle East. And finally, a picture of an M1. After considerable debate, now the Europeans will start to supply the Ukrainians with this class of fighting vehicle, which will give them, once they're trained and they can operate it reasonably well and learn how to repair them, because they're much more sophisticated than the weapons they've been using, which are of the Soviet design era. They may well be, by this early spring, in the position to launch a series of counteroffensives. And the big question is, can the Russian defenders hold, or will this be a moment in time where the Russian army goes the way of Kerensky's army of 1917. As the army actually, like the Egyptian army in the second day of the 6-day war, it fought like hell for one day, and then it all started to fall apart. We will see. We have also been providing their Air Force and also their ground forces with increasingly sophisticated ammunition, including precision-guided weapons, which allows a fighter bomber to fly at very high speeds at low altitude, pitch up and basically lob guided bombs to hit targets that have been designated by the Ukrainian ground forces to avoid, in essence, Russian local air defenses. This class of weapon, and then finally, we're beginning to deploy a weapon that's double the range of the current guided munitions that the Ukrainians used with devastating effect, called a ground-launched guided munition, which is basically a rocket motor and a small bomb that has pop-out wings and therefore is a glide bomb and can fly out to roughly 90 miles and hit a target with very high accuracy. All of this is underway as we speak. Much of the debate about the fighter bomber decision, whether we should supply F-16s or whatever, most of the journalistic community doesn't understand anything about air power or modern aircraft. That's a multi-year process to train anybody to fly that class of aircraft. And in fact, we know from our own experience in providing F-16s to the Poles, Egypt, Iraq, if the pilots have had an experience or grown up on Soviet aircraft, they have a harder transition than a brand new cadet who's going to go directly into the more modern, complex fighting aircraft. And again, this is a very complicated process of building maintainers. The whole process, the infrastructure of a modern NATO Air Force is such that for all the talk of saying, well, let's give them jets, whatever, it's just talk. The reality, it will be these modern strike weapons that will make a big difference in the war in the next 6 months, not new jet aircraft. Again, we've seen this fascinating story involving Putin's chef. This is Mr. Terezin, the head of the Wagner Group. As some of you remember Eric Prince of Blackwater. He is basically Moscow's Eric Prince. He's had a complicated relationship with Tsar Vladimir Putin. For a while, it looked like we were seeing the creation of an alternative military structure. Kind of think of this like Himmler's Waffen-SS. It was going to challenge the influence and authority of the general staff. Over the last couple of months, it's become increasingly clear that Putin has decided that his chef has become much too dangerous, an autonomous player. And so therefore, his capability of sustaining military operations with the Wagner Group are in the process of being absorbed and eviscerated by the general high command of the Russian armed forces, because they've become big rivals, because Prigozhin has been one of the most vocal critics of Vladimir Gerasimov and Shoigu. So this has been an interesting power struggle. The question here, will portions of the front become extremely fragile if the turmoil, the internal turmoil within the Russian military establishment gets so severe you see mutiny and other phenomena? And will that be one of the moments in which the Ukrainians launch this new wave of offensive operations? I'm going to only touch down the note. There's been no Star Wars, no nothing. I will give you a simple answer why this has not happened. The Russians have a much weaker capacity to observe the Earth than the United States or everybody else. One of their key allies, China, has deployed a large space station in orbit. The last thing they want is a war in space. It does not serve their interests, and therefore, I think is one of the constraints on the Russians is that they start fighting in the cosmos in the belief that they can cripple some of our intelligence collection and management systems. So, that's the war in space. I'm sorry. Cyber war is an interesting story of the Russians trying very hard, but we, as they say, it's an interesting story. We were much better prepared. And we also helped the Ukrainians. And in turn, Ukrainians were turned out to be very good at this business because they've been sort of at war, basically, in Russia for 7 years. And so they've been fighting the Russians in this domain. So actually, they were surprisingly well equipped, although one of the key enablers was our favorite space tweet, Elon Musk, in providing Starlink, this mobile communication system, which actually proved vital in the early days of the war when some of the Ukrainian systems were disabled. On the subject of nuclear weapons, I want to highlight actually the picture in the middle. What is that picture? That is the picture of the Tennessee, an SSGN, which carries either 20 to 24 long-range mobile warhead ICBM class missiles. Next to it, further up in the picture, is a Vanguard class SSBN. Above it is something called the E6 Takamo. Now, what is that? That is a modified 707 aircraft, which is designed to communicate with these submarines when they're submerged. There have been a number of incidents like this where we have quietly signaled to the Russians, as well as, by the way, the French doing a similar series of signaling exercises to suggest to Vladimir and his entourage, you're fighting, the NATO alliance consists of 3 nuclear armed states. You don't want to screw around with this. And I think one of the interesting side stories here of a success so far by the Biden administration is actually to enlist the Chinese in very open political campaign to tell Vladimir, knock it off. Well, we'll see how well this deterrent strategy works, diplomatic strategy works, especially if we head to an endgame where it looks like the Russians are going to suffer catastrophic military defeat in Ukraine and possibly lose Crimea. This is just to remind you of what nuclear weapons are all about. As I like to say, us, the naked chimpanzees control cosmic weapons. And if they're used even in small numbers, they can have extraordinary effects. But again, the challenge is, how do we react? What will we do? I think the signal has been sent that if they use weapons against the Ukrainians, nuclear weapons, we will intervene militarily with our air power. We will decisively change the course of the battle. I believe that's what the threat is, and the French have all but said this is the threat that's been made explicitly or under the table to the Russians. What if the Russians stare us down and escalate? Well, then we run the risk of something far and far more dangerous than all of us in this room and elsewhere went through during the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. Vladimir, by his actions against Ukraine, has expanded NATO and unified it. NATO is very weak. You see, this is one of the aspects about Putin's calculus. He ascribed military capabilities to NATO in many ways that didn't exist. I mean, the Europeans were very happy to sign on to Frank Fukuyama's notion of the end of history, especially the Germans. They really had basically disarmed over the last 10 years. One of the reasons why we actually can produce more bombs and bullets is because we didn't disarm. And one of the reasons why we didn't disarm is we fought these long, protracted wars in the Middle East. So we had an industrial capacity that actually Europeans don't in producing such mundane things as bullets, bombs, etc. And so one of the interesting questions is, how big, how long will this period of unification last? It depends on events. But the reality is that NATO has been expanded, albeit the Swedes and the Finns wait the tender mercies of Sultan Erdogan to decide whether to say yes or no. But be as it may, in the end, and already de facto, from a military point of view, Sweden and Finland are already in this alliance. Another phenomenon which can be discussed at length, which is because The Europeans, especially Germans, had become very comfortable with low-cost natural gas flowing from Russia. They had become extremely dependent upon it. And then, as part of the sanction regime, which we can discuss, was designed to cripple Russia's capacity to generate income. Remember, it's a petro power as much as anything, certainly a resource power. We had a process here where the Germans in particular had to figure out ways to quickly develop the capability to import liquid natural gas from a variety of sources, including the United States, but also start in motion a process of creating a electrified transportation system and also a power system reliant on the creation of the ability to produce by electrolysis and other means hydrogen as a relatively very clean fuel of the future. And it would be, the electricity would come from massive investment in the Dogger Banks, which are in the North Sea, of a newer generation of wind turbines. And so that process has been accelerated. Now, you can have an interesting debate here about how successful the Europeans will wean themselves off of this reliance. But I would argue one of the interesting effects of the war is it's accelerating this process. Although in the near term, unfortunately, in places like China and India, there's been a surge in coal consumption, if only to deal with the fact that the price of liquid natural gas being bid up by the Europeans has become so expensive. So this is a complicated story, but the reality is that Russia is basically its ability to generate income to sustain a society that's been very badly damaged by this war, directly and indirectly, might be seriously curtailed over the next decade. The other aspect which we can discuss is the emergence, where we saw with the drones being used extensively, is the next generation of robotization of warfare in all domains of warfare. And this historically reminds me of the Korean War, Stalin's folly. At the time, just before the Korean War, we were having a debate whether we could afford spending $16 billion then-year dollars on defense. Stalin gives the okay for the North Koreans to invade South Korea. By the fall of 1950, we have quadrupled the size of our defense spending. And with it, we drastically militarized the Cold War. And also it gave, if you will, life to NATO, which in many ways, up to that point in time, had been a talking shop, because the Europeans were struggling to sort of come out of the terrible effects of World War II. And so from a strategic point of view, I would argue the Korean War was one of Stalin's greatest mistakes. In the same fashion, I would argue that's what Putin has done from a geopolitical and historical point of view. Conclusion, end of history, the idea was an illusion. A better quote might have been, you may not have been interested in war, but war is interested in you. Leon Trotsky, 1930s. And unfortunately, we live in a world that has many of the features, both domestically, internationally, of the late 1930s. And that, as they say, history has reemerged in all of its fulsome features. And again, the administration has faced acute, simultaneous domestic and foreign challenges. And even if the war ends in a Ukrainian victory, which we can argue without nuclear escalation, this crisis, I think, is a hinge in history. And again, this is going to be a major distraction for us. We are focusing on the challenge of China as a long-term, more credible, serious threat. Again, I think Vladimir Putin, by this massive, unprovoked invasion, kind of like the decision of North Koreans to invade South Korea, or our decision to go in and liberate Kuwait, Putin has successfully turned the defense and the fate of Ukraine into a vital U.S. national interest. And that's a profound change. And again, we've had this regeneration of NATO. Again, the Chinese and the Iranians are carefully watching how the alliance will react I think they've been somewhat stunned by the scale of the economic financial sanctions, as well as the flow of military hardware, etc. And as I mentioned, it appears to me that one of the good longer-term effects is this transformation may really accelerate the transformation to a more sustainable global energy supply system. We will see, but this is something to watch for. So I will conclude this morning's presentation by saying, once again, as I've said to you before, one has no particular gift of prophecy. The only thing I can assure you, you won't die of boredom. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Let's thank Peter Wilson for being our speaker today. Certainly informative presentation packed with lots of facts. We have two questions that are germane to today's topic. If you have any questions and want to post them in the chat box, now is the time. The two questions, one is on, you mentioned the loyalty of countries south of Ukraine. Is that loyalty based on their loyalty to the USSR?
What do you mean? You're talking about Turkey? What the question?
Okay, so Hamid, can you unmute your mic and ask that
Yes.
question?
Yes, I can. Peter, the Romania, the Moldova, besides Turkey, their cooperation or lack thereof. What is it based on?
Hamid, Romania has been extremely stalwart. And in fact, most people are aware of the fact that we and the French have military brigades, meaning army brigades, deployed near Moldova. And I suspect they're in preparation for the occupation of Moldova if Russia tries an attempt to overthrow the current government. And I suspect we've also signaled to the Russians we're prepared to do this. Moldova is a very weak state, and the Russians have, by historic relations, have people inside who are more loyal to Russia than they are to Moldova, live in this little strip of land called Transnistria, where there are actually 3 Russian battalions. But those military battalions cannot be reinforced by the Russians because, as I mentioned, the Russian Air Force dares not fly over Ukraine for fear of being shot down. And then finally, the Russian Navy is no longer in a position to try to provide assistance to Moldova from the sea. So, or Transnistria, as the case may be. So I would say in that situation, Turkey is a story unto itself. And here Sultan Erdogan has played both games quite brilliantly, even though he's made a mess of his own economy.
Okay, thank you. And Hamid's other question was whether Ukraine can survive if its territory east of Napier is taken away.
East of where?
Napier River.
Well, yes,
Donbass region.
No, it could survive, but it would be very badly damaged. I think that's the short answer.
One quick
And I
one.
see it.
Julie Lazar has a fairly lengthy question. Can you
There's
unmute
one
your?
above it that says, why Russia has not used its Air Force to pulverize Ukraine? Don't they have a Curtis LeMay? And the answer is, they use their medium bombers to pulverize Loretta and Grozny, but they dare not fly those airplanes over Ukrainian territory because Ukrainian air defenses, especially now that they have been drastically upgraded by NATO, would easily shoot those airplanes out of the sky. And then,
Okay, so Julie Lazar has a question, a fairly lengthy question. Julie, can you unmute yourself and ask the question?
Yes, I've just heard about Elon Musk threatening to not allow the Ukrainians to use Starlink anymore for military purposes, and also that the Russians are having some success jamming signals between unmanned drones and the operators. And so this, I guess it's basically a telecommunications question. I wonder what effect these things will have.
That's a very good question. The interesting question, which I don't know the answer to, is have the Ukrainians and NATO, for that matter, been building an alternative infrastructure, telecommunication infrastructure, space-based to Starlink, which is a possibility. Even, being an entrepreneur wants to make some money off of this war, as well as being generous. I think initially he was much more anti-Russian because of his rivalry with Roscosmos and the idiot administrator Rogozin, who has basically been fired by Putin. Now he's playing a strange game, which may not be, unfortunately, inconsistent with his own domestic views of the world, but that's a broader story. Starlink has been very important. I don't think it's vital to the ongoing conduct of the war. And also, yes, both sides are carrying out jamming attacks, but I will remind you, jammers which are radiating radio frequency, energy in an enormous quantity, especially the big jammers, are ideal targets for these long-range precision strike weapons. And the Ukrainians, and to a lesser degree, the Russians, mainly the Ukrainians, have been successfully attacking these EW assets. Next.
Okay.
Thank you.
So
Sure.
Peter, Ursula Scott has asked a question about what it would take for Ukraine to win, and then somewhat related to what Hamid was asking, do they have to take back all their territory?
Well, I think this is going to be the big, brutal question about how the war ends. And we obviously can't know for certain how it will end. To me, the big question mark is the fate of Crimea. And my friend and RAIN colleague, Bill Courtney, and I have written articles about this subject. I think it is highly likely Ukrainians will successfully take back all of Ukraine proper, with a possible exception of Crimea. We will see. They're clearly going to have to be given very substantial sustained support. It's not just support military side. Basically, Ukraine's economy has been wrecked, very badly damaged by this air campaign by the Russians, and therefore is going to need, for the foreseeable future, very large quantities of financial support. So it's a big bill to sustain Ukraine, but as I said to you before, I believe this administration is completely committed. And oh, by the way, Lady McConnell made a very strong statement here the other day, and basically has signaled that the Republican political establishment, the degree that exists, is now totally committed to the defense of Ukraine. And in fact, will criticize the Biden administration for not giving more weapons sooner. But be as it may, there's clearly an emergent split within the Republican Party about whether we're giving too much or too little.
Okay, thanks. And the final question comes from either Jonathan Hill or Dale Miller Hill. And it's about whether refugees are still able to escape from that territory. And then Dale, if you can unmute your mic, I'm not sure what you mean by the second part of that question.
I think that's the spelling of Zelensky.
Yeah, you're right. I'm sorry. Yeah, basically on the refugee front, I'm just curious, we keep seeing stories about Ukrainian citizens hanging on and still there in the city. And I'm wondering if there is still an ongoing process of escape of citizens to neighboring countries, or is Zelensky somehow discouraging this?
Okay, as far as I know, the government has made no attempt to discourage the flow of civilian refugees. There is a réveillon order. All young men up to the age of 50 cannot leave the country. So young men have to stay and fight in one fashion or another. A great deal of volunteers have occurred. And this, I go back to my earlier comment I made to our friends here in River Road in the fireside room. Everyone has done great wonders in unifying and solidifying the sense of national identity inside Ukraine. I would also note that, yes, 8 million Ukrainians flowed into Eastern Europe, mainly Poland, in the early phase of the war. Millions of them have actually returned, especially in those areas like around the capital, Kharkiv, etc., to try to resume their lives, obviously, is a very difficult circumstance. So there's a regular flow back and forth between Ukraine proper and these refugees laden states. The biggest burden is being held by Poland, followed by Germany and elsewhere. And we're also taking them, and as I mentioned, a little bit over 100,000 of them. And again, the reality is, this is at the moment, a lot of these are going to be very bright, talented, capable people. Some will stay and some will return. I suspect you'll see not as large a diaspora, if only because I think the Russian army will ultimately be defeated.
Thank you. So there are a couple of questions which are not directly on point, but asked by two people, Chris Hager and Arthur Schlesinger, whether China is more or less likely to attack Taiwan given events in the Ukraine. And that's up to you if it's too.
That's a absolutely fair question. If you had heard my longer presentation, I would directly address that. I think at least in the near term, Emperor Xi has got up to his ass in alligators domestically because of his failed COVID lockdown policy, which is a good example of a large, powerful bureaucracy being stuck on stupid for a long period of time and doing a great deal of self-damage. Now they're recovering from that era, but they're also plagued with the reality they're not prepared for the expansion of the pandemic itself and its consequences. There's a whole host of other issues. The military side, which we can discuss at some other day, is that I think the shock to the Chinese was one, to use the vernacular, the piss poor performance of the Russian army shocked them as well as anybody else. And two, this impact of guided munitions. Ask yourself, if you're a Chinese planner, how long will an amphibious ship survive a 100-mile trip on its way to Taiwan in the face of a Taiwan, much less the intervention of the US Navy, armed with these long-range precision munitions? That this may be, as they say, a very complicated suicide pact from a military point of view. So I think the impact, at least in the near term, is probably, it's reduced the probability of war in that part of the world.
Okay, well, thank you again. If you want to unmute your mic and clap for our speaker to thank him. I know Peter is moving out of the area. I don't know how many people know that, but he is moving to Tennessee. So I'll allow everyone to say goodbye to him. The room will close shortly, but Peter, if you want to say goodbye and make a few comments, you're welcome to do that.
That's where Betty's family is from. We're down the road from the family farm and three of her sisters. The fourth sister lives in Brentwood, south of Nashville, and our youngest son, who has a 15-month-old with a wife who's also a professional, as they say, needs help. And we've also reached both of us the age of 80. We decided time to take action. We're going to miss everybody greatly, but again, we're not moving to southern Patagonia. And so therefore, we'll be back here from time to time and try to attend church events and all the rest. But as they say, sayonara.
Thank you for everything you've done.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank
Bye-bye,
you.
Peter.
Best to you and Betty.
Yep.